All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unravel a really fascinating mystery about political survival. Have you ever watched the news and just wondered how certain politicians seem, totally immune to massive corruption scandals, while others get completely forced out over the exact same stuff? You're definitely not alone. So let's dive right into the hard data and figure out the true price tag of corruption.
It's honestly a major puzzle in political science. Take a look at this contrast. Why did a corrupt leader like Carlos Salinas in Mexico thrive, while Venezuela's Carlos Andrés Pérez completely fell from grace? Well, Salinas faced massive accusations of corruption, especially surrounding his 1988 election. Yet, he actually achieved robust approval ratings and his party kept power. Why? Because under his watch, Mexico's economy was booming. On the flip side, over in Venezuela, Carlos Andrés Pérez faced super similar corruption allegations. But his country was in the middle of a brutal economic crisis. So the accusations stuck, and he fell from power. It's a stark contrast, right? And it really forces us to question everything we assume about how voters actually judge their leaders.
To figure this out, we really need to compare two distinct theories. First, there's the conventional wisdom, often called the accountability representation. This argues that voters always punish corruption. Like, if an executive misuses public power for private gain, citizens are supposed to express disapproval and just vote them out. It's a very straightforward moral calculation. But then we have this more cynical, pragmatic reality, which is the trade-off view. This idea suggests that citizens treat political honesty as a luxury, basically a luxury they only demand when they aren't worried about putting food on the table. In other words, they're willing to trade clean government for a strong economy.
Section 1. The data. Investigating the America's Barometer. Because to actually solve this mystery, researchers needed hard data, not just a bunch of anecdotes. So, they analyzed this massive data set from the 2010 America's Barometer study. It spanned 19 different presidential systems across the Americas. By looking at these specific systems, where the president is, a highly visible focal point, researchers could test exactly how citizens balance their distaste for corruption against their desire for prosperity. But here's the cool part. They didn't just look at broad national averages. To get a truly accurate picture, they grounded their analysis in the objective economic realities of 107 specific sub-national regions. That means they captured the real-world opinions of tens of thousands of people.
Now, the core metric researchers wanted to test against all this data was presidential approval. While elections only happen, say, every 4 to 6 years, presidential approval is measured constantly. It's essentially the ultimate scorecard for political survival. Think about it. High approval ratings translate directly into a president's political power, their influence over Congress, the whole shebang. If their approval tanks, their power basically evaporates. So understanding how corruption impacts this specific metric is absolutely crucial to understanding democratic accountability.
Moving on to Section 2, National versus Personal Wallets. Because if citizens are indeed making a calculated trade-off between corruption and prosperity, we have to ask a micro to macro question. Whose prosperity exactly are we talking about? Basically, what matters more to a voter, their own individual bank account, or the country's overall performance? Does your personal household wealth, your own pocketbook, dictate your tolerance for corruption, or is it how you perceive the broader national economy? Let's put it into perspective. If you personally lose your job, but the national GDP is absolutely soaring, do you still forgive a corrupt president? Researchers wanted to pull these two factors apart, personal economic evaluations versus what they call sociotropic or national economic evaluations, to see which one actually drives people to look the other way.
And this chart brilliantly illustrates the answer. The vertical axis here represents the negative effect, or the toll that corruption takes on a president's approval rating. The horizontal axis represents the public's perception of the national economy, going from terrible on the left to fantastic on the right. Now, notice how the line slopes steeply upward. When people feel the national economy is at its absolute worst, the penalty they apply to the president for corruption is severe, dropping approval by over 10 points. But as people's view of the national economy improves, that penalty shrinks. It literally approaches zero. If the public thinks the economy is doing great, the political cost of corruption practically vanishes.
So the crucial takeaway here is that a voter's general feeling about the national economy, that sociotropic economics piece, heavily outweighs their own personal financial situation. The researchers actually found that while your personal pocketbook does matter a tiny bit, its effect is surprisingly weak. It's the overall macroeconomic climate that is at the absolute forefront of political evaluations. If the country seems to be doing well overall, individual voters are, shockingly, quite happy to give a corrupt president a completely free pass.
All right, Section 3, the regional reality. You know, it's one thing for a voter to simply say they feel the economy is good or bad on a survey. It's another thing entirely to measure the actual mathematical economic deterioration occurring in their specific geographic region and see if this trade-off behavior still holds true.
To test this out, the researchers categorized those 107 subnational regions into different realities based on severe income deterioration. They wanted to see how objectively bad times alter accountability. So, they grouped regions based on the proportion of people reporting their household income decreased over the past 2 years. Specifically, they compared regions where only 20% of households lost income, against regions facing severe economic crises, where 40% of households lost income.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between these regional realities. Take a look at the graph plotting presidential approval on the vertical axis against the perception of corruption on the horizontal axis. See the lightest line at the top? That represents regions where only 20% of households lost income. It's practically flat. But look at the dark line representing regions in severe crisis, the ones where 40% of households lost income. That line plunges downward aggressively.
Here are the exact numbers drawn from that graph. In those economically devastated regions with a 40% income loss, high corruption tanks presidential approval by over 9 points. Citizens in these struggling areas are furious, and they tie that fury directly to the corrupt executive. But in regions with only 20% income loss, which are comparatively better economic times, it has basically no effect at all. The public simply looks the other way. The objective reality of the local economy acts like a strict volume dial on the public's outrage over political corruption.
Which brings us to Section 4, the price of corruption. We've observed this political behavior under a microscope, right? Breaking down both subjective feelings and objective data. So what does this actually mean for how our political systems function in the real world? Well, these key findings lay out a rather Machiavellian reality. Citizens clearly and measurably trade honest government for economic prosperity, and the national mood decisively trumps individual bank accounts. But for political strategy, this means anti-corruption campaigns really only stick during economic recessions. If you're an opposition party, your message only resonates if the economy is failing. Essentially, an incumbent president can survive massive corruption scandals simply by ensuring the GDP keeps growing. They can quite literally buy their way out of accountability just by handing voters a strong national economy.
Which brings us to the ultimate uncomfortable question to take away from this explainer. If a leader guarantees economic prosperity, how much corruption is the public willing to buy? The data shows that the threshold for acceptable corruption rises right alongside the GDP. It really forces us to ask ourselves about our own priorities as citizens. When times are good, are we truly holding our leaders accountable? Or are we just happy to take our cut of the prosperity and look the other way? Thanks for walking through this data with me today. Keep asking the hard questions.